Ananta then looked at the stranger curiously. It was the first time he had seen someone who could scare a stone rhinoceros with his mere appearance. The stranger looked at him with a smile and asked, "Boy, are you all right?" Ananta later recalled that day, after meeting this stranger, his life changed. It changed forever. After that he brought his new teacher, as he introduced himself to him, to the village of their tribe, which was situated on the bank of a river so valuable in those parts. Their tribe was nomadic and periodically moved from place to place, getting food by gathering, hunting and fishing. The tribesmen greeted Ananta with joy, but were wary of his companion. One of them asked Ananta if he was still wandering around. Then they asked who was it that was walking beside them. Ananta replied that it was all right and it was an acquaintance of his who had helped him a lot. But immediately another voice was heard shouting his name, and the sound of which frightened Ananta very much. It was his sister, who was now running towards him and asking him where he had been missing for so long. Running up to him, she grabbed his cheeks and told him not to tell her that he was going to the spirit world alone again. If something happened to him, what would she do without him? Then she noticed the strange lizard on his head and asked him where the strange animal had come from and why he had brought it with him. Ananta simply replied that the lizard had followed him and that was all, he couldn't get rid of it. It was only then that she noticed the stranger who had come with her brother and asked who he was. Ananta introduced her to her teacher. He called him master and introduced his sister Ashita to him. His sister suddenly coughed and cold sweat covered her face. She coughed out black blood on her hand. Ananta immediately ran up to his sister and asked if she was all right. She told him not to worry and rather go with her to the house. But her look was not good. The stranger noticed all this and was quickly coming up with a plan how he could use this gullible boy. When Ananta and her sister left, the stranger was invited to the chief of the tribe to meet him and learn from him the purpose of his visit to the tribal lands. There he was immediately offered refreshments and invited to make himself comfortable. The tribal chief was pleased with the guest, for they do not often receive foreigners, so he told him that it would be disrespectful not to treat a guest who had helped a member of their tribe. He also told him that he could rest as long as he needed to continue his journey. The stranger introduced himself as Master Ryu and was grateful for their tribe's hospitality. As we see in the past incarnation of Wings was not embarrassed to call himself by other names and deceive gullible people. Wings incarnate looked at the lizard incredulously. She didn't have much sympathy for him either, as if knowing his true intentions. The Wings incarnate's eyes glowed bright blue again and the lizard hid frightened behind Ananta, who had already helped his sister and had come to listen to the conversation. The elder said that Ananta would show the guest around the neighborhood, which he was not at all happy about and asked why him. The warrior who was sitting near him put his hand on his head and advised him not to argue with the elder. But before letting the guest go, the chief had a few more questions for him. He wondered what had brought Master Ryu to such wild places where everywhere the land was broken and unfit for travel. The incarnation of Wings confidently replied that he was an explorer and was studying customs, locations, and incarnations from various regions. The chieftain did not fully understand what he was saying and asked again what kind of incarnations. The guest pulled a scroll out of his bag and offered him a look. Then he unfolded the map and explained that from the empire in the east to the glaciers in the far north through the deep forests of the west, he had traveled for many years collecting legends and traditions. He was particularly interested and fascinated by the tale of a deity that had been passed on in this wilderness by word of mouth for centuries. Ananta listened to his teacher fascinated, though he did not understand what he was talking about. But the elder and the older tribesmen suspected what he was talking about and asked him to specify which deity he was talking about. Incarnate Wings answered them and gave them a name that put them in awe, Azidahaka. He explained that this ancient black dragon had received the power of the gods and he was one of the 6 incarnations. He was called the greatest and strongest of all incarnations. He was treated with reverence and fear by all, and with terror behind his back. He was called the demonic incarnation, the black dragon Azidahaka. And at that moment, he was sleeping peacefully in one of the caves among the rocks near this village. A fire was burning brightly in the middle of the teepee, and something was cooking in a cauldron. Ashita held the bowl in her hands and looked at its contents with surprise and bewilderment. The white-haired man said that the black dragon was to blame, adding that what she drank was a healing herbal potion from Celestia's empire, which strengthened her immune system, restored her vitality, and filled her body with strength. Hearing this, Ananta exclaimed in surprise that it was great. After drinking the potion, the girl thanked Master Ryu with a happy smile on her face and said that she felt that she would feel much better today. Telling her not to overwork herself and to get more rest, the man headed for the exit and said he had to go. Hearing his words, the protagonist asked with interest where he was going today. The man replied that he was going downstream, as he needed to keep exploring further. Ananta immediately asked if he wanted to go fishing at the same time. When he heard a positive answer, he told his sister in a happy voice that he was going with the master and would be back soon. When he was about to leave, he was stopped by his sister's voice, causing him to turn around in confusion. Ashita smiled softly and wished him a happy journey, adding that he should return safely. He smiled widely and thanked her, and replied that he would be back soon. As he left the village, Ananta felt something and turned around. To his bewilderment, the people of his own village were giving him cold and gloomy looks. Not understanding what was going on and why everyone was looking at him like that, he continued on his way without giving it much thought. After a while, the protagonist and Master Ryu arrived at the river. After building a fire and roasting the fish they had caught, Ananta turned to the master and told him that he had been living in their village for a week. He asked how his research was going. He replied that he hadn't made much progress, but that he had learned some stories from the Black Dragon's heirs. Then he told them that in the past their ancestors had suffered from the invasions of neighboring tribes, but thanks to the help of the Black Dragon, they had successfully managed to defeat the invaders. In addition, all the inhabitants of the settlement were the heirs of warriors who had honored the Black Dragon as the savior of the tribe since ancient times. Looking at Ananta, who was munching on a fish and listening to his story with interest, he said that was all he had learned. Then, with a heavy sigh, he told the boy that the people of his village had avoided talking about the Black Dragon for some reason, as if they were hiding something. The boy replied that perhaps it just seemed that way to him, trying to cheer him up. Master Ryu turned to Ananta and asked him if he was still sneaking out to hunt in the wasteland. This question made him tense up. After pointing at his body, he added that he tried not to show it, but he noticed that he had recently received many small wounds, which his sister would soon notice as well. The protagonist, on the other hand, in an agitated voice asked the master not to tell his sister about it as he didn't want to worry her about nothing. Putting his hand on his chest, he said that winter would soon be upon them, and so they should make as much prey as they could. There was plenty of it in the wastelands. Then he told the man that they had no parents, as they had died of illness when they were young. His older sister had been too protective of him, and now he was just a child to her. Lowering his head, he added that she had always been very busy with daily chores as well as taking care of him, which made him think that he should at least hunt. Looking at the boy, the white-haired man asked if it was hard for him. He smiled brightly and replied that it wasn't hard at all, because it was all for his family. Saying that it was time to stop with the heavy topics, Ananta asked the man why he had started researching all these incarnations. Taking a fish from the fire, the man replied that he wanted to find divine revelations. Hearing this, the boy asked what that meant. He replied that these were the sources containing the sacred powers of the 6 incarnations, whose might surpasses all the laws of the world and is beyond human comprehension. He went on to say that the 6 incarnations had once been endowed with the powers of the gods, and if anyone managed to collect them. After a short pause, he added in a grim voice that person could become a being who could see far beyond this world. Hearing this, Ananta said in a surprised voice that his story was like the legend of the ancient scales. Hearing the boy's words, the man asked in shock what he was talking about. Ananta realized that he had said too much. The master was unusually interested and asked him what he knew about it. He scratched the back of his head and said that what he was going to tell him would have to be kept secret. He told the master that his sister had told him this story when he was a child. The story said that the Black Dragon, in a rage, after destroying the offenders of their people, did not stop there, and continued to kill and destroy everything in its path, until it turned all the western wastelands into ashes. In an effort to limit himself, the black dragon gave the scales to one of their ancestors, causing him to lose the source of his power and fall into a deep sleep. Then their ancestors erected a temple called the Dragon Gorge. There they placed the scales of the sleeping dragon and put the best warriors of the tribe to guard it, all to protect the scales of the black dragon from evil people. Hearing this, the man wanted to say something, but Ananta stopped him. He apologized and said that although he was his apprentice, he could not tell him more. There was a look of coldness on the man's face. The boy continued, saying that the elder had allowed him to stay with them for as long as he wanted, so if he decided to go anywhere else, he would be happy to take him there. Hearing this, the man replied that in that case there was a place he could take him. By sunset, they arrived at their destination. Running across the sand and making strange noises was Ruby. Was suddenly picked up by a hand. The owner of the hand was Ananta, who put the lizard on his shoulder and told him not to get discouraged, as they had already reached their destination. But suddenly his attention was drawn to something ahead of him. Ahead of him, his master stood on the edge of the cliff, gazing thoughtfully at the setting sun. Turning to the boy, he said that he had a dream. Beyond the border of this world he wanted to find the edge of the land that would connect their world to the world of the gods. Then turning his head, he said that until he fulfills this dream, he will not stop. Looking at the boy with a slight smile on his face, he added, "I won't stop even if the whole world turns against me." Ananta stared at the man with a bewildered look on his face, surprised. When he came to his senses, he asked him what he was talking about, and with a colder look he asked him if he hadn't already realized that his older sister's illness was actually caused by the black dragon's curse. At these words, the protagonist's eyes widened. Confused, he asked again what the man was talking about, to which he asked if he knew much about the dragon. The boy began to answer, saying that the one's name was Az-Dagaka, he was a servant of the demon god, ruling over death and curses. Master Ryu immediately told the bewildered protagonist that the incarnation could not have served such a god for nothing. After all, could a god entrust divine revelation to mere mortals without reason? The lizard sitting on the protagonist's shoulder took on a threatening look, as if it didn't trust the man. The same continued, saying that the dragon was just using their tribe, he had passed on to them the curse of the demonic revelation that he himself had carried before. He looked down at Ananta with a smile and said that his parents had died for the same reason, and that his little sister was suffering from a terminal illness. Thinking back on it, the protagonist marveled at how the man then managed to convince him so easily. It's all because of the black dragon's curse. The boy's face grew dark. He believed it. As soon as he asked his master in an unsure voice if what he said was true, a smirk appeared on his face as he knew the boy had fallen into his trap. Reaching into his hiking bag and pulling out a flower that glowed white, he told the shocked Ananta that this sacred flower was to be donated to the sacred treasure that protected his tribe. Handing the flower to the boy, he added that once he did so, the dragon's curse would disappear, as would his sister's illness. When the boy looked away from the flower that could be his hope, he asked the master if he wanted him to break the rules of their village. He replied that he could only suggest it, while he had the choice to make. He added that even if the result was painful, the responsibility for that choice would be his alone. The night village slept deeply. Waking up in the middle of the night, Ashita opened her sleepy eyes. She looked at the place where her younger brother was supposed to be sleeping, but to her surprise he was not there. Pulling her cloak over herself, coughing she walked out of the tent. Looking at the starry time, she anxiously wondered where he might have gone at this late hour. She added to herself that she hoped he wouldn't catch cold on such a cold night. At the same time, near the entrance of the temple, Dragon Canyon, 2 tall guards armed with spears stood guard at its entrance. Suddenly, something caught the attention of one of the guards. Seeing a figure approaching from one side of the canyon, the man stood in a fighting stance with his spear in front of him and told his companion that someone was coming. The man was none other than Master Ryu, who looked at the men who were shouting at him to stay back with a cold stare. Seeing that he continued to approach without intending to listen to them, one of the guards lunged at him with a shout, trying to impale the stranger with his spear. However, his spear could not reach its target, as he simply grabbed it by the tip. The guard's eyes widened in shock and horror at what he saw. The next moment, Master Ryu kicked the man's neck, causing his eyes to turn white. At the same time, the other guard, holding his spear in his hands, watched in horror as his comrade fell to the ground unconscious. The next moment he suffered a similar fate as the stranger slammed him into the wall with a single blow. The unconscious body of the second guard slowly sank to the ground. Turning back to where he had come from, he turned to the boy and told him he could come out. Ananta appeared from behind the rock, holding the flower carefully in his hand. He glanced at the unconscious guards on the ground and noted that his master was strong, for he could defeat two of the best warriors of the tribe with a single blow. He went inside and said that they should hurry up and finish what they had planned before dawn. Ananta followed him. At the next entrance, 2 torches were burning brightly to illuminate the interior. After walking down the corridor and disarming the rest of the guards, they reached a room, on the wall of which hung a red flag with the sign of a black dragon, and in the middle of the room was a chest covered with some ancient writings and images of dragons. In the next moment, Ananta looked confusedly at the flower, which seemed to start glowing even brighter. He asked his master excitedly what was going on, but he only chuckled. Then he told him that there was no need to be afraid, because everything was going according to plan. A wicked smile appeared on the white-haired man's face, which Ananta, who was standing behind him, was unfortunately unable to see. Removing the lid of a chest in the middle of the room, from which a bright golden light poured out, the protagonist and the man looked at its contents. Ananta stared at the scales with tension. As Master Ryu saw the item in the chest, which was made up of scales, and was surrounded by magical writings that glowed with golden light, he said that he had finally found the last piece. Looking at the artifact, he noticed a scale that was the only one that was turned upside down, which made it clear that this was the dragon's weakness. Turning to Ananta, who continued to hold the flower in his hands, the man thanked him for enlightening him, for it was only thanks to him that everything had happened. The same excitedly turned to his master and asked with hope in his voice, "Is his sister going to get well, because he did what he told him to do?" Then, in a voice trembling with excitement, he asked if there was any hope for them. But his hope was shattered the next moment. He put his hand on his shoulder and said in a cold voice that people like him were very stupid. Hearing this, the protagonist looked at the man with wide-open eyes and asked him what he was talking about. With a devilish smile on his face, he said in a cold voice that it was time to pay for his sins. Then he suddenly grabbed the boy's hands, which were holding the flower, pulling them towards the artifact. When Ananta saw this, he cried out in panic and asked what he was doing. He didn't answer, but simply brought the flower closer to the wrongly turned scales, causing them to glow with a bright golden light. The next moment the light turned white and engulfed the protagonist. A white pillar of light rose from the canyon straight into the sky. Seeing it, Ashita, who was standing outside and looking at the starry sky, she wondered if the pillar of light had come from the dragon's canyon. The next moment, however, a tremor shook the ground, causing her to cry out. At the same time, somewhere in one of the caves in the canyon, in the middle of the cave, a black dragon was sleeping on a flat space that looked like a nest. But in the very next second, its eyes opened. Rising up on his massive paws, he spread his huge red wings. In the next instant, the ground near the gorge shook. And out of it, leaving behind a puff of dust, a dragon flew like a black arrow into the starry night sky. The villagers who had been awakened by the earthquake and had already managed to rise from their tents were anxiously wondering what was happening. Suddenly, one of the men pointed his finger to the sky and fearfully told the others to look up. In the sky right above them, a huge black dragon was flying straight towards the white beam. As it flew toward its goal, the dragon wondered who was the unwise one who coveted the power of a god. Where the temple used to be, there was now only ruined rubble, in the midst of which Ruby was screaming in panic, trying to revive Ananta, who had lost both arms and now lay bloody on the ground in front of his pet. When he came to his senses, he gave a painful moan and turned his head to the lizard, who was looking at him with tears in his eyes. Shifting his gaze in front of him, he saw a silhouette that stood in front of a bright pillar of light that seemed to reach the heavens. That person was none other than his master Ryu, who with a smile on his face reached out his hand towards the pillar of light that levitated the flower that had transformed. Taking it in his hand, he said joyfully to himself that he finally had it in his hands. "Come, then, the miracle that transcends the limits of this world," he said. The next moment a light engulfed him. A moment later his clothes disappeared, and he looked in his pristine form with a smile at the flower, which glowed with a snow-white light. However, in the next moment, he grasped the flower with both hands and stabbed the sharp edge of the flower into his chest. The place where he stabbed the flower began to glow with a bright light. The next moment he spread his arms wide and let out a heart-rending scream as white threads began to spread from that spot all over his body, connecting with the threads that were already present in his body. After a while, everything subsided and the beam of light disappeared, leaving behind only a white-haired man on one knee. In the next moment, a huge black dragon landed in front of him. The next moment he looked at the man with his red eyes and said with rage in his voice that he had touched the dragon's only weakness, and then asked him if he knew what it meant. The man looked at him with a relaxed gaze and nodded. The atmosphere around him completely changed, the aura he now emitted resembling a divine one. Introducing himself as Az-Dagaka, the dragon told the man to say his name. In the next moment, a white barrier formed around his body, as if some kind of transformation was taking place. A moment later, a clear soft voice sounded, accompanied by the appearance of snow-white wings, as well as the complete transformation of the man, who said that his name was Gyo. "I am the incarnation of wings." The creature that appeared in front of the dragon had the body of a bird with an eye in the middle, as well as 3 pairs of large snow-white wings. Its head resembled a dragon's head, with a halo of stars shining above it in a semicircle. It was a creature that was truly awe-inspiring to everyone who looked at it. The wind created by the wings of this majestic-looking creature kicked up dust, causing Ananta, who was lying on the ground, to lower his head to the ground. He groaned in pain and raised his head, wondering what had happened. In front of him, at some distance, a huge black dragon was sitting on the ground, staring with its red eyes at some snow-white angel-like creature that was floating in the sky above him. The dragon looked angrily at Gyo, who was floating in the sky, and said that he sensed that the treasures of the gods were hidden in his body. Then adding that it was impossible, as even the incarnation was not able to combine them all in one body. With a wicked squint of his eyes, he asked him what he had done to the real owners of the treasures. To which he replied that he shouldn't ask such obvious things. For he must have known that he had killed them all and taken their revelations. Then spreading his snow-white wings, he formed 6 spheres of light, which in the next instant were aimed straight at Az-Dagak. Once they hit him, the spheres exploded and created an explosion. That caused a cloud of dust to gather around the place for a few seconds. As soon as the dust cleared, the unharmed dragon appeared behind it, successfully blocking the attack with its wing. Turning to him, Gyo said that he had willingly given up his own, which was why he was so visibly weakened. He then arrogantly said that he had only become a ghost of the divine era, adding that he would personally crush him. Az-Dagak's eyes shone with an even stronger red light, while a bright yellow light began to appear in his mouth. "Try it if you have the strength," he said. Releasing a huge fire attack from his mouth, aimed at the incarnation of wings. However, he was able to dodge the attack without any problems, flying away. Az-Dagaka immediately lifted himself off the ground and flew into the air. And then rushed in pursuit at breakneck speed. Gyo retreated and flew higher and higher into the sky. Seeing this, the dragon immediately formed many magic circles and fireballs appeared on them. The next moment, they like a rain of fire flew straight to the embodiment of wings, which stopped running, turned around to repel the attack. A ball of bright white light began to form in front of him. After his words, "Let there be light," he created an explosion that instantly destroyed all the fireballs flying at him. Such a turn did not surprise the dragon, as he realized that such an opponent could not be defeated so easily. Suddenly everything around him was colored in blood-red tones, and black-red fire appeared around the dragon. The next moment after flapping its wings, it was heading towards Gyo. But Gyuyo had no intention of running away or dodging. Hovering in place, he opened his wings wide. In the next moment, he flapped them forcefully, sending a multitude of snow-white streaks of light at Az Dagok, which, after colliding with the dragon's attacks, destroyed them. But they didn't stop there, they headed straight for the dragon. The next moment there was a huge explosion that created a small star in the night sky, shining brightly and illuminating everything around. But in the next instant it turned into a huge white ball. The villagers who had come out into the outside watched the scene with fear and trepidation. "Ananta!" murmured Ashita with worry in her voice, looking at the huge white ball in the sky. The same at this time spitting out blood from his mouth and enduring excruciating pain, with a pained tone he stood up. Kneeling down and breathing heavily, he stared at the ground. Raising his head and looking towards the village where his sister was supposed to be, he mumbled her name in a worried and anxious voice. At the same time, the defeated dragon fell to the ground with a loud crash, raising a huge cloud of dust on impact. Az Dagok's huge but barely alive and wounded body lay motionless on the ground. While in the sky, Gyuyo, who had taken on a slightly more human form, was floating in the sky, looking at his defeated opponent with a haughty look. Grinning haughtily, he turned to the dragon who was already on the verge of death. He said that he had torn his heart out. "You have lost to Az Dagok." Whereupon he chuckled happily. Raising his head up and looking at the beautiful starry sky, he said in a dreamy voice that he would finally reach the heavens. The next moment, turning into a snow-white beam of light, he soared even higher into the sky. Looking at it with a shocked and broken look, with tears in his eyes, Ananta wondered how this was possible and why it happened. After all, he had just done it for his sister. Suddenly the main character's thoughts were interrupted by someone's voice. Turning around he saw a black dragon lying on the ground. He said in a weak voice that it was now clear to him how the incarnation of Wings managed to pull it all off, because he was helped not by anyone else, but by those to whom he entrusted his secret and weakness. On hearing this, Ananta, with tears streaming down his face, in an apologetic and pitiful voice started begging the dragon to forgive him as he was doing it for his sister. "What a pity, now the demon god has to die with regrets," Az Dagok said. The next moment, his body glowed with a blood-red light, followed by a cold and fierce voice saying that he would not forgive him. "I curse you," he said, after which his body faded and began to disintegrate. The very next moment, however, everything turned blood-red again. And from the dead body burst forth a terrifying dragon spirit, which raised its head and uttered a shrill roar. Ananta, who was sitting on the ground, watched as it completely emerged from the dead body. Horror was reflected on his face, for even he knew that he was a demon god. The dragon blazed with fire and soared into the sky. But the realization of where it was going made Ananta feel cold inside. His eyes widened in horror as it flew toward his village. In a few moments the dragon flew towards the village, where the villagers stood in the street and stared at him with fear and bewilderment. However, the dragon did not come to these people to make a commission or agreement. This time he had only one purpose: to kill and destroy. To wipe out those to whom he had entrusted his life and who had failed to preserve it. The next moment, a sea of fire rained down on the village, turning it into a hell. From everywhere came the dying and painful screams of people burning alive. Ashita was no exception, and she was consumed by the fire like everyone else. In an instant, an entire village was wiped out. "No. No. Sis," still not believing what was happening, shouted Ananta. His eyes were widened with horror while tears were streaming from his eyes. He wanted to rush to his sister, to find her and help her, but... The next moment a huge dragon head appeared in front of him, which opened its blood-red maw at a great speed, approaching him intending to swallow him. A moment later, the dragon's remaining power descended upon the protagonist. He was immediately engulfed in red-black flames, causing his eyes to glow white. This flame began to penetrate every cell of his body, reaching his heart. It colored it blood-black. His hands began to regenerate, while his face looked more like that of a demon than a human. His body began to grow flames, and less resembled a human body. The next moment it formed into a dragon, which opened its maw and let out a loud roar. Az Dagaka, who was disappearing and dissolving into nothingness, said to Ananta, who had already finally turned into a dragon, that he would now be forever surrounded only by death and destruction. These were the dragon's last words, after which silence reigned. Under the starry sky, in the midst of the devastation, Ananta, who had received the dragon's curse, sat alone in the world and had to bear the responsibility for his choices. A lone torch hanging on the wall illuminated the corridor of the dungeon, as well as the door of the cell, where our protagonist kneeled with his head in chains. The hatred in and lust for revenge in his eyes was not about to disappear. After Ananta was defeated and helplessly falling approaching the ground, the incarnation of Wings along with Ziz looked at his falling body engulfed in black smoke. He commented on all this, saying that Ananta had traveled a long and winding road. He got what he wanted and wasn't going to linger here any longer, so he said it was time for them to go back, leaving a shocked Nadia behind. They were all going to return to their sanctuary together. For this, the guardian of the Wing incarnation was once again about to open the portal, tearing the very fabric of space. With a few of his blows, the space in front of him shattered like glass, revealing an endless void in front of them. But before they could pass through the portal, the Wings incarnation's attention was stopped by a voice. Ziz even turned around to see who dared to speak to the Wing incarnation. It was Nadia, who said that Ananta had told her that the Wing incarnation was a vile creature who thought he was a god, but that the child next to him was also a true incarnation. She asked for an answer. After all, she couldn't remember anything now until she met the Wing incarnation in the past. Nadia wanted to know if this child could be one of the 6 true incarnations. But the Wings incarnation didn't answer her directly, only smiling remembered the name of the boy he had abused in the past, and said that Ananta was actually that boy from the past. He was not going to linger here and explain everything to her, so he headed to his portal and said goodbye, that everything in this world is just a combination of cause and effect, and when that connection is broken, everything disappears. He smiled one last time and added that this is what is called fate. He looked at the tense Nadia and, calling her the embodiment of nature, said that he looked forward to their next meeting, and after a moment he and his companions disappeared into the portal. Nadia was left alone, not knowing what to do next and trying to come to her senses. A few weeks after these incidents, and somewhere deep in the mountains of the northwest, a lone figure with long red hair was taking a bath in the middle of a huge cave. 2 girls approached her and addressed her, "Your Majesty." They were 2 battle-hardened warriors, and they had news for their ruler. They reported that news had come that Lord Bernhard was returning from the southern frontiers. The ruler began to rise and said that this was the best news he had heard in days. Coming out of the water, he turned to the girl who had brought him the news and said that she was lucky, because if she had brought bad news she would have gotten a slap on the wrist. She couldn't agree more, she was lucky indeed. They all knew their ruler's temper. Another female warrior immediately put a robe on him. The ruler asked who he was returning with, not the incarnation of the Wings by any chance. The girl answered that according to the messenger's words, 1 incarnation and 2 people were going with them. And it was unknown exactly what kind of incarnation it was. As it turned out, the ruler was a woman, a very muscular woman. And when she heard the answer of her subordinates, she smiled and said that as always it would be better to see everything with her own eyes and draw conclusions herself. The fortress looked imposing, secure and impregnable. It was built right in the mountains, and it adjoined them, using their natural landscape for its defense. And right now a group of several travelers who had finally reached their goal were entering its huge gates. Among them was Nadia and Lord Bernhard. Nadia walked beside the Lord and thought about her companion. To her, he was really like Ananta, for as much as he too had a personal score to settle with the incarnation of Wings. She was here now because when the Wing incarnation had left through the portal, Lord Bernhard and his warriors had approached her and, after introducing themselves, invited her to the headquarters of the organization he served. At first glance it might seem that the reason she was invited was because of the battle and her participation in it, but in fact the only thing he was interested in was the power Ananta possessed. Who, by the way, had survived the defeat and was captured by Bernhard's warriors. But there was another interesting thing. As soon as the fight was over, Whitefoot disappeared without a trace and Nadia never saw her again. So in essence Nadia could have gone anywhere and no one would have pursued her, but she decided to go to the northwest of the continent to meet the head of the organization to which Lord Bernhard belonged. Absorbed in her thoughts, she did not notice that they were led straight to the throne room and the doors were opened in front of them. The herald announced in a loud voice that Lord and Duke Bernhard had arrived. A spacious room in Nordic style came into view. In the middle of it was a red carpet with warriors lined up on either side of it. From their appearance, one could tell that not all of them were 100% human, and some of them were also incarnations. Some of them stared at Nadia incredulously. The others paid absolutely no attention to her. She and Lord Bernhard stood beside them. Immediately after them, the herald announced the arrival of Her Majesty the Queen. Nadia watched her every step carefully. She recalled what she had heard about her on the way here. The Queen was the first princess of the Munguk Valkyries of the warrior race and she was actively opposed to the incarnation of the wings. Her name was Ragelsa Einherjar, leader of the Levitian. She immediately sat down on her throne and announced with a smile that the Queen had arrived. Before her, Nadia and Lord Bernhard came to the reception. The Queen greeted them and said she was glad they had finally arrived. She cheerfully asked him to skip all formalities and go straight to the results of the expedition. Bernhard immediately began to report the results. According to their plan to reach the temple at Caves, they had killed a group of gladiators in the arena and provided themselves with cover. They had some unforeseen circumstances along the way, but eventually they managed to get into the temple. It was there that he encountered the incarnation of Gyo's wings. Hearing his words, some of the warriors froze in surprise. The Queen was eager to hear what happened next, so she hurried him on. Bernhard sadly continued that immediately afterward he engaged him in battle, but to his shame he lost. The Queen did not like what she heard and asked him how he dared to return home in disgrace and without information. Bernhard's face was grim, but he replied that defeat as well as victories are part of a warrior's life, and their number does not matter. And with a forceful clenching of his fists he added that in the end he would surely kill him with his own hands. His answer pleased the Queen. And she laughed and said, "That's right, now she would definitely recognize her faithful Bernhard." But now, more importantly, she wondered what incarnation was beside him. Bernhard apologized for not introducing her sooner and said that it was Nadia, the incarnation of nature, and she was part of another group, also pursuing the incarnation of wings. After telling the Queen a bit about her, he stated that she was their new ally and agreed to help them. So he brought her here and introduced her to the Queen as a thank for the help she had given them during the expedition, especially for nursing his wounds. But someone was missing, and the Queen asked her the rest of the group she had been told about in the report was. The warrior replied that those could hardly be called members of the group, as they were just a wounded male savage and a little girl who had offered them cooperation in return for their treatment and protection. The little girl herself is fine and they will give her to a foster family later. But the male savage is lying unconscious in the infirmary, his condition is extremely serious and he is badly mutilated. The warrior said that if the Queen wanted, they could bring him here by force. But she said not to. Queen Ragelsa walked right up to Nadia and told her welcome. And then held out her muscular hand to introduce herself, introducing herself as Ragelsa Einherjar. Nadia shook her hand and thanked her for the warm welcome. But the Queen was in no hurry to let go of her hand and asked what she expected from the cooperation with Levitian. Nadia was taken by surprise by this question. Seeing her confusion, the Queen warned her that if she was an infiltrated spy, she wanted to know about it immediately. Nadia said that she wanted to know everything about the tree branch that was embedded in her body. But as soon as she said that, someone from the audience shouted out the Queen's name. One of the female warriors, who looked like a werewolf, shouted furiously to the Queen not to listen to the stranger's tales. She could smell the stench of wings right from here. She immediately pointed her finger at Nadia, asking if she really had the branch she had received from the winged one inside her. One of the horned warriors gave her a disgruntled look. Nadia was silent, not knowing what to say, and then the Queen asked if it was true. Nadia answered that yes, it was true, and she could still feel the branch resonating inside her after the meeting with the winged incarnation. But after that she added that despite all that, she knows absolutely nothing about it. The queen asked Bernhard if he was the one who told the girl about the branch. But the man replied that he had no right to share any information without her consent. The queen looked closely at Nadia. If she was the one the wing incarnation was looking for, then this was an extremely good chance for them. However, a frightened warrior suddenly burst into the hall and addressed Her Majesty directly. The queen was angered by this behavior and asked why the devil she had barged into the hall during a royal meeting. The warrior apologized and said that the matter was extremely urgent. For right now a demon had awakened in one of the peaceful areas with citizens. It was Ananta who woke up and went into a rage and then began to destroy everything around him. There was a merciless massacre. So what could have made Ananta go on a rampage and start destroying everything? Let's go back to the beginning of Ananta's story, to the very night when the incarnation of wings took everything from him, everything he held dear. After the destruction of the village, Azitahaka's dragon curse began to weaken a bit and Ananta began to regain control of his body. He was still in the form of a horrible lizard blazing with black fire, but he was no longer in dragon form. Pain and rage filled him and there was nothing he could do about it. He realized that he was beginning to lose himself and that his consciousness was slipping away from him. Ananta was one step away from becoming such a monster forever, losing his self. He needed something to remind him of who he was. The monster he had become turned his ugly head towards the burning village. When he saw it, he realized that something terrible had happened and everything else faded into the background for him. He was finally able to control this beast and stepped first one tentative step. Then another. And then he ran straight on four limbs toward the village. He ran really fast, leaving only a trail of black and red aura behind him. He ran as if his life depended on it and he could change and fix something else. But as he reached the edge of the burning village, he roared in despair and his scream filled the surrounding valley. It was a scream of despair, rage and pain. Ananta's eyes widened and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Everything he loved, his native village where he grew up and lived his entire life, was engulfed in merciless flames and many charred corpses lay around. Seeing all this, Ananta regained full control of his body and mind and the curse began to recede from him little by little. His horrible burning shell began to vaporize. And Ananta took the first tentative step. Next he was completely free of the remnants of the curse and headed forward. Now he was only interested in one thing, or rather only one person. The hands he had lost had now recovered and were burning with the same black-red aura. He approached one of the burned corpses in desperation. It was his beloved sister whom he had wanted so badly to help, but he had made things worse many times over. Ananta leaned over the corpse, drenching himself in tears and not knowing what to say. He had lost so much in one day and all because of his stupidity. Looking at her burnt corpse, the only words he could squeeze out were to wish her peace and a happy journey in the other world. But then he ran out of words and his eyes filled with bloody tears. Ananta started screaming desperately and lifted the burnt corpse in his arms. He bent over it tremblingly. Once again he could not hold back his desperate and heart-rending cry as streams of bloody tears flowed unceasingly down his face. All this was watched by the White Foot, and she heard the desperate promises of Ananta, who threatened the incarnation of the wings that he would kill him himself with his own hands, and he swore to it. Ananta, with all the anger of which he was capable, shouted, "Gyuyo," hoping that his desperate cry would reach the heavens and be heard by his assailant. Ananta had remembered this countless times already and woke up from this nightmare, but even so his eyes were still filled with tears. He was all bandaged up and lying on the bed. He found himself in the middle of an unfamiliar house and wondered what this place was. It turned out that all this time there had been a little girl with big ears like a desert mouse beside him near the bed. She said an incomprehensible phrase, "Kokanin," and stared rapturously at our hero. Ananta looked at her carefully and did not realize at once what kind of creature she was. But such cuteness frightened him. He thought that this strange girl might be an incarnation, since she had such an unusual appearance. But then he hurriedly got out of bed, because he had no time for all this and could not afford to rest for so long. The only thing he was interested in right now was how he could find that hated incarnation of wings, Gyuyo. However, He didn't even have time to get up before streams of black blood flowed from his mouth, nose, and eyes. The little girl stared uncomprehendingly as Ananta tried to cough up the blood. When the streams of blood stopped, he found it difficult to breathe. His vision became blurred and he could barely see anything, just a pool of blood on the floor. He knew it was all payback for overusing the curse. The next moment he fell helplessly from the bed to the floor and thus frightened the little girl. But as soon as he was shaking and struggling to get up, the girl ran outside as if nothing had happened. Behind her she left the door open. Ananta saw this as his chance to escape from here. Outside, he found himself in the middle of a huge cave, with many houses and life bustling around him. But as soon as Ananta found himself in the middle of the street, many of the inhabitants began to look at him fearfully. And they looked at him warily for good reason. He didn't look good, and he was barely walking, tearing off his bandages and barely moving his feet. He looked around in confusion, wondering where he was. As he looked around he realized that although the place was very large, he couldn't see the sky. He was probably in an underground city, but how could he be here? He didn't remember how he got here. Suddenly his movement in the crowd was stopped by several guards who ordered him to stop. They explained their demand by saying that he looked suspicious and was clearly not a local. They advised him to surrender without resistance, for if he refused, they would be forced to attack him. Ananta exhaled tiredly. It was the same old story again, only it was the first time he had appeared somewhere. The guards always wanted to kick him in the side because of his unusual appearance. He answered them as usual that they could try. But suddenly some man with a sword appeared near him and turned to the guards. And casually asked them if by any chance they had seen their little girl. But while he was talking to the guards, Ananta noticed his arm, or rather the tattoo of a symbol with an eye and wings on it. Ananta immediately remembered how many years ago Whitefoot advised him to memorize this symbol, because it would help him to find the embodiment of wings. He remembered how many of his followers had this symbol. Ananta called out to the stranger and was about to put his hand on his shoulder. But in the next instant he almost lost his arm as the sword whistled through the air. Ananta managed to dodge, but the sword whistled just millimeters from his eye. It was very close and the sword even clipped Ananta's hair a little. The stranger turned to him and said with a smile that he was sorry about that, but he didn't like being touched on the shoulder from behind. Ananta was not about to let such insolence go unpunished and regained his balance. He immediately delivered a crushing blow with his fist, which the stranger still managed to dodge. The stranger looked at Ananta and thought to himself that this man was really strong. The stranger jumped away, breaking the distance, and said that it was a good attempt, but now it would be his turn. But he thought to himself, wow, this man looks like he's going to drop dead, but he's not afraid to fight back. And there was a very powerful aura emanating from Ananta, which his opponent could see and was beginning to regret getting involved. Ananta wasn't going to fight for nothing either, so he asked the swordsman how he got that mark on his right hand. And what did it have to do with the incarnation of wings? But he didn't get an answer. Instead the swordsman quickly attacked. Ananta barely managed to dodge the first blow. But it was followed by a series of blows, several of which left deep cuts on the chest of our protagonist. The swordsman wielded the sword, which seemed to be an extension of his arm, and with it he unmistakably struck blow after blow. Ananta, retreating, was forced to press himself against the wall. The swordsman, seeing that his enemy was confused, smugly told him that if he wanted answers, he should try harder. And added that the only option for him to get answers was to beat them out by force. His sword glistened as he prepared a crushing blow about to finish off this poor wounded monster. With a single sword thrust, a cutting wave of tremendous force rushed towards our protagonist and smoke flew in all directions, enveloping everything around him. It wasn't clear if the blow had hit its target or not. When the dust cleared, the swordsman was surprised by what he saw. Ananta had partially transformed into a beast and defended himself from the blow with his hands. A large cut was visible on the wall behind his back, but he was unharmed. And now he was staring at his opponent with a vicious and focused stare. The swordsman pretended to have everything under control and asked with a sneer, "What happened to his hands?" While the guards did not share his calmness and in horror sent a messenger to inform the queen of what was happening and request reinforcements as soon as possible. Ananta's eyes flashed with rage and he rushed to the attack with his clawed hand. He wasn't going to take it any further. His strike was powerful and fast, but the swordsman managed to dodge and casually reflect it with his sword. The swordsman dodged blow after blow and realized that each attack was powerful enough that if he met it directly, his sword would most likely fail. But he immediately noticed that his opponent had a weakness. As he was now far from his best condition and after a series of such attacks, was breathing heavily and seemed to be barely standing on his feet. Suddenly Ananta bent over in a fit of coughing. The swordsman saw his opportunity in this and realizing that this was his chance to win rushed into the attack. With one lightning-fast and masterfully honed lunge, he stabbed Ananta in the chest. Usually in such cases it was already over, and the swordsman was sure of his victory, but this was an unusual case. Instead of dropping dead, Ananta's body began to blaze with black flames and curse began to spread all over his body. The swordsman didn't realize what was happening. Ananta no longer looked like a human, his face was gradually turning into the toothy mouth of a black dragon. His face was distorted by a grimace of rage, his eyes began to blaze with fire, and he let out a terrifying roar. The terrified swordsman was forced to retreat, he drew his sword from Ananta and jumped away. Ananta meanwhile screamed horribly in pain and continued to transform into a dragon. In a moment, the dragon-like lizard was already standing in front of the swordsman blazing with anger and rage. The inhabitants of the underground city, who saw all this froze with fear and horror unable to even move. Even on the face of the swordsman flashed a shadow of doubt and fear, his hand trembled. The terrifying beast from his nightmares, all in black flames of rage was approaching him. The swordsman realized that his sword would be as useless as a toothpick in this situation and returned it to its scabbard. He finally realized what emotion he had experienced a moment ago. He seemed to have experienced what real fear was for the first time in his life. Compared to such a gigantic monster, he was so small and useless, but he still wasn't going to give up and prepared to accept his fate. But suddenly he was called out by a voice that called him owl and told him to retreat. It was Queen Ragelsa, who had personally come to the rescue and was now preparing to deliver a crushing blow to the beast. She delivered a mighty blow right to the neck at the base of the beast's skull. Such a blow would have severed the bear's head instantly, but it only left a small cut that made the dragon roar furiously. The queen stood right in front of it, surrounded by a squad of warriors. They surrounded the beast on all sides and blood was pouring from the wound in its neck, but it seemed that none of this could hold the dragon back at all. Nadia begged them to stop, not to harm it or kill it because it was not their enemy at all. But Queen Ragelsa was of a different opinion. She said that since he had harmed her people, she would not keep him alive. After that, she got into a fighting stance and said that she would finish off this ugly monster right here. The dragon's eyes flashed with red rage. But what happened next surprised everyone present. It raised its giant clawed paw. And in a lightning-fast movement, he thrust his claws in. The queen stared at him with incomprehension. What kind of mad creature could be capable of such a thing? It appeared that Ananta had sunk his claws right into the slit in his neck. Ragelsa didn't understand why he was doing this. But he didn't stop there and thrust his other hand into the wound and began to tear it open with both hands. With a sickening sound his head began to separate from his torso. It was a sight not for the weak. The warriors around him also didn't understand what he was doing and why he was killing himself. Eventually he ripped off his own head and fell as a flaming corpse to the ground. Of all those present only Nadia felt sorry for him. The others looked at the burning corpse with fear and incomprehension. The queen also wondered who the hell he was. Even though he had made his damn dragon kill himself, Ananta was still alive and now lay unconscious on the ground. After a while, one of the female warriors was reporting to the queen. She reported that according to her instructions, the barbarian had been imprisoned in the dungeon and placed under vigilant guard. So was the embodiment of nature, who was also in custody and awaiting her judgment. Right now they were still looking for witnesses, but at first glance that scene of the rampaging monster was an eerie chaos. Another warrior added that soon rumors would spread around the fortress and it was only a matter of time before the people would start demanding the execution of that beast, the demonic incarnation. When everyone had gathered around the round table, just like King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table, the Queen announced that they were starting an emergency meeting and everyone present was already aware of what had happened. The main issue at this meeting is a foreigner named Ananta. And the Queen added that she will make a final decision only after listening to all the points of view present here. The first to speak was a woman named Rupa, who was the 4th Levitian commander and the incarnation of ferocity. She asked how long they were going to keep this monster in their fortress and added that there was nothing to decide, just kill it and that was it. Next was Owl, the 3rd Levitian commander and the embodiment of a swordsman. He disagreed with the girl's idea and told her it was very cruel. He advised her to use and research Ananta because he is a very curious character. Next was Tarkhan, 2nd in command of Levitian and the incarnation of conquest. He said he didn't care at all. After listening to them the Queen turned to Bernhard and asked if he knew of this barbarian's abilities. He confidently replied that, yes he knew. Bernhard was the 1st Levitian commander and the incarnation of valor. Hearing his answer Rupa was indignant, asking him if he was joking. Why did he bring this monster into the fortress and what was he thinking if he knew how dangerous it was? Bernhard replied that he agreed that Ananta's presence had caused chaos. However, he still felt that they should have left him here. He turned to the Queen and added that his power was undoubtedly very great and dangerous and yet he absolutely harbored a hatred for the incarnation of the wings like everyone here. If they could get this power and strength under control, it would become an extremely useful weapon in their hands. After listening to everyone, the Queen made her decision. She decided that it should be kept as an auxiliary force. Rupa disagreed with this decision and resented how anyone could listen to such idiotic suggestions. She looked for support among the actions present and turned to Owl, reminding him that he had fought him and saying that if he was more serious he could have solved their monster problem with one blow and there would be no problem now. But he didn't see it that way and replied to her that it wasn't really right of him to say that, considering that he himself had forced that fight. Lastly, he added that Bernhard was right and this guy would be very useful. He recalled the moment from the fight with Ananta and said that if they had fought seriously and to the very end, neither of them would have left in one piece. Such words surprised Rupa very much and she asked, "What?" But still, all of Rupa's outrage had no effect on anything since the Queen had already made her final decision. Just at that moment a silhouette appeared at the beginning of the hall. Upon seeing it, the Queen told the messenger of the Rabbit's Foot Information Agency to enter. Whitefoot, already familiar to us, entered the meeting room. She joyfully announced to everyone that Whitefoot, the nicest of all the agency's employees, had come by order of the Queen. While the meeting was going on upstairs somewhere deep down in the dungeon a lonely prisoner was languishing. Ananta was firmly chained in 3 chains at once, which of course could not hold him if he let loose his curse, but he did not want to do that himself just yet. As it turned out he had visitors with another messenger from the Rabbit's Foot Agency. She asked Ananta-san how he was doing. She went on to say that she had already feared he would run away with his tail between his legs, but as it turned out there was no need to worry. Ananta in reply only looked at her with his tired look. When the messenger saw him, she admired the look, so much so that she said it made her lose her temper. Who was she? Whitefoot came closer and said hello to the great Empress and the glorious heroes present. She said cheerfully that as a humble information merchant she was paying her respects to all of them. All but the Queen stared at her. They didn't understand who she was or how she got here. On top of that she wasn't herself, she had the same little girl with her that had been next to the unconscious Ananta and now she was holding Ruby the lizard, who seemed to have accepted her fate as a teddy bear. Owl greeted the little girl cheerfully. He called her Raclette, and said she was like a walking nuisance and would disappear in a flash if distracted by something else for even a minute. Whitefoot advised him not to minimize his merit, for the little one had the same power as she did and could subdue space. Bernhard looked at the messenger and asked the Queen who she was. The Queen appeared to be familiar with her and replied that she was a highly ranked member of a news agency known as the Rabbit's Foot. And a few weeks ago she had offered her a deal. Then with her sweet smile Whitefoot asked the queen if she was interested in the power to destroy the incarnation of wings. Then she went on to say that at first she had regarded such a request as half-crazy nonsense, but now she was sure it was possible. It was as if Whitefoot had it all figured out and calculated ahead. Then the queen was intrigued by her offer and asked that she state her terms and what she wanted in exchange for her services. Whitefoot clapped her hands happily and said that their conversation was moving gently and beautifully, and the only thing she desires is a continued partnership between Rabbitfoot and Levitian. In return, their organization would use all of their power to help them defeat Wing's incarnation. And will offer them the services of Revenge Incarnation. While the queen was telling the terms of the deal to her charges, the doors of the dungeon Ananta was in were already open. The chains that held Ananta were also broken. And just as Whitefoot finished presenting her terms she was interrupted by a voice that said it was all garbage information. The girl rabbit was at once awkwardly silent from this. The queen and everyone present stared in surprise at whoever had come. He asked, "How dare they claim to be able to surpass someone by making all this noise? It doesn't matter what it is, cooperation or compromise, none of this is necessary." The mouse girl looked questioningly at her guest. The lizard that was in her arms immediately came to life and was happy to see a familiar face. It immediately jumped out of the little girl's arms and ran towards its master with a squeal. Ananta continued his speech saying that the only one who will kill the incarnation of Wings is him. And no one dare stand in his way. Rupa immediately became enraged and started transforming into his incarnation saying that he is a scoundrel and a criminal and should be in the dungeon. And anyway, what are the guards doing here that he is walking around unhindered? She turned to the queen and asked her to just give the order and she would beat the crap out of this guy right now. The queen ordered her to calm down because she wants to hear what he's offering. Rag Elsa turned her attention to Ananta's scars, which covered his entire body. Each of those scars spoke of the number of battles he had fought in. And the frenzied energy that flowed intensely under his skin and filled him. It couldn't be compared to anything she'd seen before. So he was a carnage in the flesh, this human embodiment of carnage and revenge. Whitefoot immediately became worried and lost all her confidence. She pointed to Ananta and said that this was the strongest trump card of their organization. But Ananta did not tolerate this attitude and immediately put his hand on Whitefoot's head making her shriek in fright. With a grim face he looked at her and asked her since when did he become the property of their organization, did she want to die with such statements? While Ananta was showing Whitefoot who was in charge, another female employee of the news agency approached him from behind. She quietly approached him from behind, hugged his arm, and said that despite everything he had lost to the incarnation of the Wings, it would be difficult for him to go it alone and that's why he needed allies. Ananta looked at her incredulously and thought to himself, what a bastard. The rabbit girl called Blackfoot looked at Whitefoot's situation and commented that she seemed to be having a hard time. Whitefoot replied, it's exactly as you can see. But then she said that more important than that was that Ananta was losing control again and it looked like the adjustment of his powers was complete according to their plan. But suddenly the queen intervened in all this and asked Ananta directly if he was really capable of killing the incarnation of the Wings. Whitefoot immediately began to say that according to their treaty. But the queen with a serious look stopped her at once, saying that she was asking Ananta and not her. And added that Ananta's origin was of no importance to them. Ananta was in no hurry to answer and the queen continued by saying that she still had certain doubts about him, but she had also seen his power with her own eyes. All those gathered here have one single goal, to destroy the incarnation of the Wings. And that goal also served as the basis for the creation of their organization. For example, the person he recently engaged in a fierce battle with, Owl, the swordsman incarnation. He was once a member of a clan that served the incarnation of Wings, but the clan was destroyed by one of its members who harbored a grudge and gained power from the incarnation of Wings. For this he swore vengeance and burned the mark on his hand with his own hand. And the queen had gladly accepted him into the ranks of their organization for it. Now what the queen saw was the savage rage that Ananta felt for the incarnation of the Wings. Ananta finally spoke and asked the queen what her name was. She immediately replied that her name was Ragelsa Einherjar. Ananta finally left Whitefoot's head alone and asked the queen rhetorically if she wanted to know if he could kill the incarnation of wings. He confidently declared, clenching his fist, that he possessed a power that had almost no limits. In fact, the more cursed beasts and incarnations he devoured, the more power he gained from them. Because of this, his strength was able to grow endlessly. And once he regained all his power and devoured all the monsters, he would tear the wing incarnation apart. So he advised them to shut up and cooperate with him because it was the only way for them to fulfill their goal. Rupa was so cocky and insolent that she asked him if he had lost his nerve, but the queen seemed to think otherwise. And the next moment she laughed out loud, saying, "Truly a shameless fellow." After that she rose from her throne and said well. She began to walk up to our hero and swear the honor of a queen. That Leviathan would join with him, the embodiment of vengeance, in an alliance. So the legendary alliance was made and now the incarnation of wings had no chance or not. After that, the queen immediately summoned her 2 assistants. And told them to bring Nadia here. Meanwhile, somewhere far beyond the borders of their world in the sanctuary of the wing incarnation. Along the corridor of the sanctuary, the wing's incarnation's protector, whose name was Bekheron, was pacing. He came to the door, stopped and waited to be allowed to enter. After a second, the voice of the wing's incarnation sounded, telling him to enter. The next sight appeared before him. In the arena Ziz had killed another magical beast, and watching the whole thing was the incarnation of wings with 4 other figures. These 4 figures were actual divine incarnations. It turned out that the incarnation of wings had gathered and subjugated 4 of the 6 divine incarnations. Ziz was the 5th. And was laughing maniacally as always after killing the beast. The incarnation of wings looking at him solemnly announced that they were celebrating the birth of a new brother. Byron bowed respectfully to his lord and said that he had gathered everyone as he had been ordered. Then the incarnation with a smile told him to open the passage. Byron struck out with his fists. And a passage immediately appeared behind his back. It led to a small island in the middle of the darkness and the incarnation of wings immediately got ready to go there. As it turned out, there were many horrible monsters and monstrosities below, waiting for the appearance of their lord.